The bullying culture in the NHS. Few institutions in Britain evoke as much affection, pride, and emotional investment as the National Health Service. The NHS has been called the closest thing the English have to a religion, a phrase that captures not only the national reverence for it, but also the deep expectations placed upon it. It represents compassion, equality, and the idea that care is a human right rather than a commodity. Yet beneath this noble surface lies a dark and persistent reality, a bullying culture that permeates many corners of the NHS. It manifests not only in how staff treat each other, but also, at times, in how vulnerable patients are treated by those meant to care for them. This is an essay about that culture, its nature, its endurance, and its consequences for the victims who live and work within it. It is not about solutions, reform, or optimism. It is, instead, an account of failure, fear, and the quiet cruelty that festers inside one of Britain's most venerated institutions. 1. The myth of the caring profession. The first and most painful irony of the bullying culture within the NHS is that it exists in a system dedicated to care. The NHS was founded in 1948 upon principles of equity, compassion, and service. Doctors, nurses, and carers enter the profession, in theory, out of vocation, driven by empathy and moral duty. Yet reality often betrays these ideals. For every compassionate professional, there is another hardened by stress, hierarchy, and institutional indifference. Healthcare work is intense, hierarchical, and emotionally charged. Within such a context, power often becomes weaponized. Those at the top, consultants, senior nurses, or administrators, can, and often do, use their authority not as a shield for the vulnerable but as a tool for control. Junior staff, newly qualified nurses, and healthcare assistants, particularly those from ethnic minorities or overseas, are frequent victims. In an industry where questioning a superior can be construed as insubordination, bullying can masquerade as discipline, tough love, or maintaining standards. There is also the mythology of stoicism, that the ward toughens you up. Within this myth, bullying becomes a rite of passage. A nurse who survives her first year under a tyrannical matron is expected to wear the scars as badges of pride. This normalization of cruelty is one of the NHS's most insidious traits, a collective shrug toward emotional harm disguised as professionalism. 2. The anatomy of workplace bullying in the NHS. Bullying in the NHS takes many forms, from overt verbal abuse to subtle psychological manipulation. It can be personal, institutional, or cultural, sometimes all three at once. It thrives on fear, hierarchy, and the unspoken rule that those who speak out rarely prosper. A nurse on a surgical ward might be publicly humiliated by a consultant for failing to anticipate an instruction. A junior doctor might be ridiculed for asking a stupid question. A cleaner or healthcare assistant might be mocked by colleagues for their accent or background. A manager might quietly sideline a whistleblower, excluding them from meetings and opportunities until they resign. All of these behaviors are bullying. Yet within the NHS, they are often framed as personality clashes, stress reactions, or communication issues. The language of minimization protects the perpetrators and silences the victims. Data consistently confirm the problem. NHS staff surveys over the past decade have repeatedly shown that around 1 in 4 NHS workers report experiencing bullying, harassment, or abuse from colleagues or managers. This is an extraordinary figure, roughly a quarter of a workforce of over 1 million. To put that into context, the NHS employs more people than any other organization in Europe outside the Chinese army. A culture of bullying on that scale is not a collection of isolated incidents, It is a systemic characteristic. Bullying in the NHS also intersects with race, gender, and class. Black and ethnic minority staff report higher levels of discrimination and harassment, often from both colleagues and patients. Overseas nurses, particularly those recruited from the Philippines, India, or Africa, are sometimes subjected to casual racism from staff who assume superiority by virtue of accent or nationality. Women, who make up around 77% of the NHS workforce, face gendered bullying, patronizing treatment, exclusion from senior decision-making, and inappropriate banter disguised as humor. In many hospitals, these patterns are not deviations from the norm, they are the norm itself. 3. Bureaucracy, hierarchy, and fear. To understand why bullying persists in the NHS, one must look at its structure. The NHS is an enormous, bureaucratic organism with multiple layers of management, accountability, and professional hierarchy. Each tier protects itself. Doctors, nurses, and managers operate in silos, with different professional bodies, training routes, and cultural norms. Within these silos, senior figures often act as gatekeepers to career progression. That power imbalance creates fertile ground for bullying. Junior doctors depend on senior consultants for references and training sign-offs. Nurses rely on ward sisters or matrons for shift allocations and annual appraisals. Administrative staff depend on managers for performance reviews and rota flexibility. In such an environment, bullying is not just personal aggression, it is institutionalized coercion. Victims often cannot afford to resist, because doing so risks career suicide. Fear is the bloodstream of this system. Staff learn quickly that complaining about a superior leads not to justice but to retaliation. Whistleblowers, those who attempt to expose misconduct, neglect, or safety breaches, are frequently isolated, discredited, or quietly removed. The NHS publicly celebrates speaking up, but in practice, it punishes those who do. There is a grim familiarity to the pattern. The complainant becomes the problem. Their performance is suddenly under review. They are moved, suspended, or investigated. The message to others is clear: silence is safer. A particularly cruel dimension of NHS bullying lies in its bureaucratic disguise. Harassment is often conducted through procedural means, unachievable targets, excessive scrutiny, malicious appraisal comments, or selective enforcement of rules. Victims are smothered in paperwork rather than shouted at. It is managerial suffocation rather than physical aggression, but the psychological impact is the same. This administrative cruelty, hidden behind policy and professionalism, is perhaps the most British form of bullying imaginable. 4. The bullying of patients. While much discussion focuses on staff bullying each other, patients also experience its consequences. In extreme cases, they are bullied directly, mocked, ignored, or treated as inconveniences. In more subtle ways, they suffer the effects of a system where compassion has been eroded by fear and hierarchy. When staff are bullied, they become defensive and detached. Compassion fatigue sets in. The patient becomes a bed number, a complex case, or a frequent flyer. Empathy is the first casualty in a culture where speaking up risks retribution. Staff who fear their managers will rarely challenge poor treatment of patients, even when they know it is wrong. There are numerous anonymous examples across the NHS where bullying among staff has spilled over into patient harm. A nurse afraid of an aggressive consultant may hesitate to report a medication error. A junior doctor intimidated by a registrar may avoid questioning a risky decision. A care assistant mocked by peers may rush through personal care, skipping dignity for speed. These are not hypothetical scenarios, they are well-documented patterns in inquiry after inquiry. Consider the Mid-Staffordshire scandal, an emblem of systemic cruelty. Between 2005 and 2009, hundreds of patients suffered neglect, dehydration, and in some cases, death. The Francis Report exposed a culture where staff were afraid to speak out, where targets mattered more than people, and where bullying silenced conscience. While Mid-Staffs was an extreme case, it was not an anomaly. Similar patterns have been found elsewhere, in Morecambe Bay, Gosport, Hwelton Hall, and countless smaller hospitals and care homes across the UK. In nearly every inquiry, bullying features as both cause and consequence, the invisible thread linking managerial pressure, moral compromise, and patient suffering. For patients, the experience of being bullied by those entrusted with their care is uniquely disorienting. They are often elderly, disabled, or dependent. They are in no position to fight back. A nurse who snaps at a confused dementia patient or a care worker who mocks someone with a stammer is not simply being rude, they are abusing a position of trust. Yet such acts are rarely reported, and when they are, the institution often closes ranks. Complaints are dismissed as misunderstandings or communication breakdowns. The victim's voice is neutralized under the weight of NHS defensiveness. 5. Psychological toll on staff victims. The human cost of NHS bullying is staggering. Victims often suffer anxiety, depression, insomnia, and burnout. Many leave the profession altogether, taking with them valuable experience and dedication. Some develop post-traumatic stress symptoms, flashbacks, panic attacks, hypervigilance, particularly if they have been publicly humiliated or unfairly disciplined. Bullying corrodes self-worth. NHS workers often define their identity through service and competence. When that is attacked, when they are told, implicitly or explicitly, that they are useless or inadequate, the psychological wound cuts deep. The irony is that these are often the very people who care the most. Bullies tend to survive because they are feared, the compassionate tend to leave because they are crushed. One NHS nurse described her experience in a confidential account. It wasn't just the shouting. It was the constant nitpicking, the eye-rolling, the sighing every time I made a decision. I started to doubt everything. I would sit in my car before a shift and cry. The patients were fine, it was the staff I was afraid of. Such testimonies are common. The NHS, for all its rhetoric about well-being, remains an environment where psychological safety is fragile. When a victim breaks down, the system often frames it as individual weakness rather than organizational toxicity. They are sent to occupational health, given mindfulness sessions, or told to build resilience. In truth, resilience is not the issue, cruelty is. 6. The role of leadership and complicity. Leadership within the NHS is often praised in public but feared in private. Managers wield enormous influence, and many operate within a culture of metrics, not morality. Their success is measured in waiting times, bed occupancy, and budget control, not staff morale or human decency. In such an environment, bullying can be a management tool, a way to enforce compliance and performance under impossible pressures. When bullying allegations arise, they are often handled internally, meaning they are rarely handled well. Investigations are delayed, sanitized, or quietly dropped. Colleagues who could corroborate claims are intimidated into silence. In many cases, the bully is simply moved sideways, promoted, or retires early with a glowing reference. The victim, meanwhile, is left ostracized or unemployed. There is also the culture of complicity, the bystanders who know but do nothing. Many NHS staff witness bullying and remain silent. Some do so out of fear, others have become desensitized. Over time, silence becomes a form of survival. To challenge the bully is to risk becoming the next target. The NHS, ironically, breeds conformity through fear, precisely the opposite of the openness and trust that true care requires. At the most senior levels, denial is institutionalized. Official statements invariably describe bullying as unacceptable and promise zero tolerance. Yet these phrases have become meaningless through repetition. The gap between rhetoric and reality is vast. Every time a chief executive or HR director issues a boilerplate apology, victims are reminded that their suffering is being processed, not acknowledged. 7. The cultural DNA of the NHS. Bullying is not an accidental byproduct of the NHS, it is woven into its cultural DNA. The system's origins in post-war Britain gave it a military flavor, command structures, discipline, and hierarchy. Hospitals were run like regiments. Senior doctors were consultants whose authority was rarely questioned. Nurses were drilled in obedience and order. Deference was the norm. That legacy lingers. Modern healthcare has changed, but the culture has not caught up. The NHS remains steeped in tradition, ritual, and status. Consultants are still treated as near deities in some hospitals. Nurses still call them Mr. or Miss, not by first name. Junior staff still tread on eggshells. The theatre hierarchy still resembles a chain of command rather than a team of equals. Even the language, junior doctor ward sister matron, carries echoes of a bygone era. This hierarchical rigidity makes genuine accountability difficult. Bullying often flows downward, rarely upward. A consultant can berate a nurse without fear, a nurse can scold a healthcare assistant, an assistant can snap at a patient. It is a pyramid of pressure, each level offloading frustration onto the one below. The ultimate victims are those at the bottom, patients and the least powerful staff. The NHS also suffers from an emotional contradiction. It preaches compassion but rewards toughness. Those who show vulnerability are seen as weak. Those who challenge injustice are branded difficult. The result is a culture that silences empathy and rewards aggression. In such an environment, bullying is not an aberration, it is a coping mechanism. 8. Bullying in training and education. The bullying culture begins early, in training. Medical students and nursing trainees are often exposed to humiliation as part of their learning. The so-called teaching by humiliation approach is particularly notorious in medical education. Junior doctors report being publicly criticized during ward rounds, shouted at in theaters, or mocked for not knowing answers. The idea that such experiences build character is an excuse for abuse. In nursing, too, students often encounter bullying from mentors who see them as threats or burdens. Overseas trainees may be patronized or excluded. Feedback can be punitive rather than developmental. Many students drop out, not because they lack ability, but because they are emotionally broken before they even qualify. This early conditioning ensures the cycle continues. Those who survive internalize the lesson: power protects, vulnerability invites pain. Some victims become perpetrators later in their careers, repeating the very behaviors that once harmed them. Thus, the bullying culture regenerates itself, generation after generation. 9. The human cost. The victims of NHS bullying are not statistics, they are people who entered healthcare to make a difference and found themselves diminished by it. They are nurses too afraid to speak, doctors questioning their worth, cleaners who dread every shift, and patients who learn that suffering in silence is safer than complaining. The human cost can be measured in broken careers, ruined health, and shattered trust. It can also be measured in lives lost indirectly, the missed diagnosis, the neglected patient, the unreported error, all products of fear. Behind every scandal headline lies a long chain of intimidation, silence, and indifference. Patients pay the price twice, first as witnesses to a demoralized workforce, and again as victims of a system too frightened to face itself. Staff pay in dignity and mental health. The NHS, as an institution, pays in credibility, yet continues to deny its own complicity. There is an almost tragic inevitability to it all. The NHS is loved precisely because it embodies the best of British values: fairness, service, decency. To admit that it also harbors cruelty feels like sacrilege. Yet until that cruelty is faced, victims will continue to suffer in quiet wards, behind closed staff room doors, and in the endless paperwork of disciplinary hearings that punish the innocent. 10. Conclusion: the silence between the words. The bullying culture in the NHS is not just about individuals behaving badly. It is about an institution that has learned to live with its own moral discomfort. It is about how systems designed for care can become engines of fear. It is about the silence between the words, the unspoken knowledge that to survive, one must look away. This essay has deliberately avoided proposing solutions, because the victims do not need optimism, they need recognition. Too often, their suffering is smoothed over by committees, reframed as lessons learned or buried under new policies. But beneath those glossy reports remain the same frightened voices, the same whispered warnings: don't say anything, it's not worth it. The NHS is, and remains, one of Britain's proudest achievements. But pride and cruelty can coexist. The uniform, the badge, the mission, none of these immunize against bullying. In fact, they can make it worse, by hiding it behind moral authority. When an organization is seen as holy, its sins are hardest to see. The victims, nurses in tears in hospital car parks, doctors afraid to question consultants, patients ignored on wards, deserve more than platitudes. They deserve the truth to be told without euphemism. And the truth is this: the bullying culture in the NHS is not a secret. It is an open wound. The only surprise is how long Britain has managed to pretend it doesn't bleed.